Imagine a city that emerged from the shadows of legend and became a commercial empire feared even by Rome. A city born from a pact of cunning, bathed by the waters of the Mediterranean and guided by the determination of a woman who defied fate. This is the origin of Carthage, a name that would resonate through the centuries as one of the greatest rivals of the Roman Republic. But how did it all begin? Before continuing, check now if you are already subscribed so you don't miss these incredible revelations. To understand Carthage, we need to go back to the 9th century BC, at a time when the Mediterranean was dominated by great navigators, the Phoenicians. These excellent merchants and explorers had built an impressive maritime empire, controlling trade routes that stretched from the Near East to the Iberian Peninsula. One of their richest and most powerful cities was Tyre, located in what is now Lebanon. But even the most prosperous cities are not immune to internal disputes. It was in this scenario that a fundamental character emerged: Elissa, better known as Dido. Her name would go down in history as the founder of Carthage, but her journey began in dramatic fashion. Dido was the princess of Tyre, sister of King Pygmalion, a greedy monarch who, driven by his thirst for power, murdered his sister's husband, the priest Archibas, in order to seize his immense wealth. Feeling betrayed and threatened, Dido saw no alternative but to flee. Accompanied by a group of loyal followers, she embarked on a perilous journey across the Mediterranean. Her route was not random. As a true Phoenician, she understood the value of sea routes and knew that she needed a territory that combined natural defense and access to trade. Thus, after a long journey, Dido and her followers reached the coast of North Africa, in the region that today corresponds to Tunisia. But there was a problem. The territory was already inhabited by local tribes, and settling there would require diplomacy or cunning. This is where one of the most iconic episodes of her legend comes in, the ox skin ruse. According to ancient accounts, Dido asked the local rulers for a piece of land that she could cover with an ox skin. The request seemed insignificant, and, unaware of what was coming, the leaders granted the request. It was then that Dido revealed her genius. Instead of using the entire skin, she cut it into extremely thin strips, forming a line long enough to enclose a large portion of land. Thus, within the limits of her ingenious negotiation, she took possession of a large and well-located territory where she would lay the foundations of the new city, Carthage, which means new city in Phoenician. What began as a modest settlement quickly flourished. The location was strategic, situated on a natural bay that offered protection from invaders and easy access to sea routes. In addition, the Phoenicians had experience in transforming seemingly unfavorable terrain into thriving commercial centers. The first structures were erected, markets were organized, and, before long, Carthage began to attract the attention of those traveling the Mediterranean. But a city does not grow only with good trade routes. To consolidate her rule, Dido needed allies. She sealed pacts with neighboring peoples, established agreements with merchants, and ensured that Carthage became a safe haven for those seeking opportunities. The city prospered, and with it, the dream of its founder became reality. However, not every story of greatness comes without challenges. The legend of Dido itself ends tragically, wrapped up in one of the most fascinating episodes in ancient mythology. According to Roman tradition, immortalized in Virgil's Aeneid, Dido fell in love with the Trojan hero Aeneas, who, fleeing the destruction of Troy, sought refuge in Carthage. The romance between the two, according to legend, was intense but short-lived. Aeneas, guided by destiny, needed to set out to found a new city, Rome. Feeling abandoned and betrayed, Dido is said to have thrown herself onto a burning pyre, cursing Aeneas and swearing eternal enmity between her descendants and those of Rome. Myth or reality, this episode seems to have foreshadowed a conflict that, centuries later, would pit Carthage against Rome for supremacy in the Mediterranean. But for now, the newly founded city had other challenges to face. Dido had established a legacy, but what lay ahead was an even greater test. Transforming Carthage from a simple settlement into a trading powerhouse capable of rivaling any city in the ancient world. Did you know that Carthage, a city founded by a runaway princess, grew into a power so immense that it rivaled Rome in its very essence? Dido's brilliant strategy, combined with its privileged location, not only ensured the city's survival, but catapulted it to the center of trade and power in the Mediterranean. And as time went on, Carthage became increasingly central to the ancient world. But how exactly did this city become one of the most powerful trading powers in history? When Dido laid the foundations of Carthage, she did not envision a city as a mere haven, but as a true commercial capital. The city was strategically positioned on the coast of present-day Tunisia, a perfect location for controlling the Mediterranean sea routes. It was at the heart of a world where the seas were the vital trade arteries for the Phoenician Empire. Carthage not only had direct access to the main trade routes of the time, but also the ability to build a vast network of ports and trading posts, essential for dominating the trade of goods and wealth. Imagine the scenario. In the 8th century BC, the Phoenicians were considered the greatest navigators and traders of the ancient world. Their vessels, known for their speed and endurance, crossed the seas and connected several civilizations from Mesopotamia to Egypt and the Iberian Peninsula. Tyre, Carthage's mother city, was already a powerhouse in trade, but Carthage, with its strategic location, began to stand out. The city came to dominate the Mediterranean grocery store, controlling the traffic of essential goods such as precious metals, glass, fine fabrics, and of course spices and exotic foods that came from the east. More than that, Carthage knew how to leverage its location to mediate trade between different cultures. But it was not only the trade of goods that made the city shine. Carthage's true strength lay in its ability to control trade routes, transforming itself into a central hub for economic transactions. In addition, one of Carthage's greatest assets was its naval fleet. The city invested heavily in its navy, creating a powerful naval force capable of protecting its trade routes and ensuring its influence in the Mediterranean. In a world where control of the sea meant power, Carthage was becoming a titan of the seas. It was as if the city was the center of a complex commercial web that connected peoples and cultures, acting as the link between East and West. The Carthaginian navy not only defended its interests, but also acted as an instrument of power projection, intimidating neighboring nations and ensuring its continued prosperity. And, as if its naval strength and commercial dominance were not enough, Carthage knew how to maintain an advantageous position through strategic alliances. For example, over the centuries, the city formed commercial and military ties with different civilizations, including the Egyptians and the Greeks. This not only extended Carthaginian influence, but also ensured that the city was not isolated in a world full of emerging powers. The city expanded beyond its natural borders, establishing colonies and trading posts on the major islands of the Mediterranean, including Sicily, Sardinia, Corsica, and even southern Spain. Carthage knew that to secure control of trade, it needed strategic points along the entire coast. These colonies were not only trading posts, but also served as military outposts and bases of power, ensuring Carthaginian dominance over the local populations. In addition, these colonies provided Carthage with unparalleled wealth, with resources such as gold, silver, and precious metals that were vital to the growth of the empire. One of Carthage's greatest strengths was its ability to adapt. The city had learned to absorb the influences of the peoples with whom it traded, adopting advanced technologies and practices of navigation and trade. Its market flourished, but there was more. Carthage began to set the economic pace for a vast region. Having become the main commercial center of the West, its influence was not limited to the trade of goods. It also extended to the realm of ideas. Many of the inventions and practices that came from the East were integrated into the Mediterranean world through Carthage, making it not only a commercial powerhouse, but also a key link in the cultural and technological development of the region. With all this, Carthage began to attract the attention of the great powers of the time. And of course, an empire like Rome, which was already on the rise, would soon realize that in order to become the master of the Mediterranean, it would need to face Carthage. What began as a prosperous city would soon become the greatest threat to Roman rule. But how did this happen? How did such a rich and powerful city, born from the ingenuity of Dido, end up becoming Rome's greatest adversary? And here is the question we will begin to answer in the next part. Was Carthage truly prepared to face Rome on equal terms? Or was its rise as rapid as its fall would be? In the next episode, tensions between Rome and Carthage will explode, bringing to light one of the most epic rivalries in ancient history, the Punic Wars. Have you ever wondered how a city that began as a modest colony expanded so fiercely and strategically, dominating large portions of the Mediterranean? Carthage was not just a trading powerhouse, it had become a military and cultural force that spread to far-flung lands. It wasn't just trade that made the city grow, it was its ability to establish itself as a force to be reckoned with. As the city prospered, its leaders realized that they couldn't rely solely on trade to ensure their continued power. Carthage began to look abroad, seeking to expand its domains and consolidate its presence. To this end, the Carthaginians founded several colonies, establishing trading posts on key islands and along the continental coasts. These new cities were not simple trading establishments. They were true centers of power that ensured control over territories that were vital to the city. Can you imagine how difficult it would have been to stay on top in the ancient world? It wasn't just a question of military strength or wealth, but of influence over those who inhabited these lands. The Carthaginians used both diplomacy and military means to ensure control over the local populations. After all, how could a distant colony be maintained without it rebelling? Carthage knew how to deal with African tribes, the people of Sicily, and even rebels in the Iberian Peninsula, always making it clear that it was the one who ruled the Mediterranean. But, as Carthage expanded, it did not only seek territories to plunder or riches. What else did the city want when it founded colonies such as Sardinia, Corsica, and part of Hispania? The answer is more complex than it seems. Carthage was rebuilding and reinforcing itself for a great battle. Instead of being content with a position of power, it knew it needed to create a strategic support network. The colonies were fundamental to this. They were not only commercial outposts, but also military fortresses that protected the city and its interests. The Iberian Peninsula, for example, was a fundamental region for Carthage, not only because of the abundance of gold, silver, and other precious metals, but also because of its natural riches that fed the Carthaginian war machine. It was there that the Carthaginians established a powerful base of operations. In places like Gadia, modern-day Cadiz, Carthage's military and commercial power flourished, creating a veritable line of defense against the growing power of Rome. Imagine the scenario. As Rome expanded its borders and increased its influence, Carthage was building a network of colonies ready to resist any advances. Interestingly, in addition to military strength, Carthage also knew how to embrace local cultures. What seemed like simple colonization often turned into a process of cultural integration. The Carthaginians were not only imposing their authority, but also creating strong and mutually beneficial alliances with local tribes. Along the Mediterranean from Carthage to Corsica, the population was a mix of Phoenicians, Berbers, Greeks and Romans who worked together to expand Carthage's horizons. With its colonies established and its trade network strengthened, Carthage seemed unstoppable. It was creating a multifaceted empire where trade, culture and military strength merged in a unique way. Imagine for a moment the power of this network. An empire that dominated the land, the sea and the minds of the people along the coasts of the Mediterranean. Meanwhile, Rome, with its imposing militarization, was drawing ever closer to Carthage, already feeling the weight of rivalry. However, Carthage was not only concerned with direct control of territories. The city knew that to be truly powerful, it had to secure the loyalty of the local populations. This was not done simply through demands and taxes, but through a process of integration. Unlike Rome, which took a harsher and more imposing approach to the peoples it dominated, Carthage offered a more diplomatic path. In Sicily, for example, where the cities were divided between the Romans and the Carthaginians tried to maintain a diplomatic stance and even offered autonomy in exchange for loyalty. This caused many of the local peoples to align themselves with Carthage, favoring the city over Rome. However, it was not just territorial control that Carthage sought. Its influence in trade was not confined to its immediate area. Carthage established itself as a kind of economic superpower that dominated trade routes that crossed continents, acting as a kind of link between the West and the East. The city had access to goods that Rome could not acquire with the same ease. In addition, it began to cultivate a network of merchants and traders that spread throughout the Mediterranean, facilitating trade with peoples as far away as Egypt and Mesopotamia. But all this did not happen smoothly. Carthage's path to Mediterranean dominance was fraught with conflict, disputes, and challenges. Rome, which until that point had seemed like a rising power, was beginning to realize the magnitude of the threat posed by Carthage. The question was no longer just who would dominate trade, it was who would rule the Mediterranean with all its riches, peoples, and cultures. And of course, here arises a fundamental question for history. Was Carthage truly prepared for war with Rome? If the city was gaining territory and trade, it lacked something essential to resist the growing pressure from Rome. But what was this weak point? Stay tuned, because in the next part we will see how Rome, which initially remained on the sidelines of this dispute, would begin to become involved in one of the greatest rivalries in ancient history. And could Carthage, which seemed invincible, withstand the onslaught of Rome? Now that Carthage was establishing itself as a military and commercial power, a shadow was falling over its destiny. Rome, the rising republic. What began as a relationship of mutual respect with minor rivalries would soon turn into one of the greatest military disputes in history, known as the Punic Wars. But what exactly brought the two powers to confrontation? At first, Rome did not see Carthage as a direct threat. It focused on expanding its territory and conquering new lands, unaware that Carthage had already become a force capable of rivaling its own greatness. The flourishing trade in the Mediterranean made Carthage a prosperous city, but its true strength lay in its ability to manipulate the balance of power. Carthage had unparalleled naval forces, a highly trained army, and a network of alliances that gave it a strategic advantage. Rome, on the other hand, was growing in political and military influence, sensing that the time had come to face a worthy adversary. Rome did not just want to dominate the Italian peninsula, it envisioned an empire that stretched across the Mediterranean, and this inevitably meant clashing with the rising Carthage. So what really motivated the Punic Wars? To understand the heart of this rivalry, we need to look at the disputes over strategic territories. The main area of conflict was Sicily, a rich and disputed land, vital for trade and control of naval routes. When Rome interfered in the local conflict between the Sicilian cities and Carthage, it was merely provoking the Carthaginian giant. However, Carthage's response was not immediate, and Rome, underestimating its enemy, quickly conquered Sicily. The first major clash between the two powers then began in the First Punic War, 264 to 241 BC, a fierce confrontation in which Carthage's forces, although more experienced and better equipped at sea, were outmatched by Rome's adaptability. The Romans, who until then did not have a significant war fleet, quickly began to learn maritime tactics, even adapting their vessels to fight at sea. This was crucial. Rome, which until then had been more focused on land warfare, showed remarkable strategic ability, building naval fleets and using war machines such as the corvus, a device for boarding enemy ships. Rome eventually won the war and took control of Sicily. The First Punic War did not end without leaving deep scars. Carthage was forced to pay heavy reparations and was humiliated, losing one of its most valuable colonies. But Rome's great mistake was underestimating the enemy. Carthage's defeat was not the end of its influence, but rather the point of rebirth of its military strength. Instead of surrendering, Carthage began to rebuild its power, and the history of the Second Punic War, 218 to 201 BC, would show how treacherous and devastating this comeback would be. The Second Punic War is undoubtedly the most famous chapter in the rivalry between Rome and Carthage. Here, Hannibal Barca, the Carthaginian commander, would become a legend. His name would resonate for centuries, not only for his military brilliance, but for his brilliant strategy that nearly destroyed Rome. Hannibal knew that the only way to defeat Rome was to strike at its heart, surprising the superpower on its own territory. And that is exactly what he did, with a bold move that became historic, crossing the Alps with his army and elephants, a feat that is remembered to this day as one of the greatest displays of courage and strategy. He not only conquered Roman cities, but also dismantled the morale of an entire nation. The Romans, taken by surprise, suffered heavy defeats in battles such as the Battle of Cannae, where Hannibal inflicted one of Rome's worst defeats, killing thousands of its soldiers. But contrary to what many might have expected, Hannibal did not finish the job. Although he won decisive battles, he did not have the resources necessary to conquer Rome. He lacked the logistical support and supply lines that Rome, with its incredible administrative capacity and organization, had been able to guarantee. Rome, on the other hand, did not give up. Instead of confronting Hannibal directly, it began a war of attrition, focusing on weakening Carthage by strategically surrounding it, attacking its colonies, and forcing it to spend precious resources on multiple fronts. After years of war and attrition, Rome decided to attack Carthage directly. Command was given to Scipio Aemilianus, who, in 146 BC, destroyed Carthage in the Third Punic War, putting an end to more than a century of rivalry. Carthage was devastated, its population was massacred, its buildings destroyed, and the city was completely razed to the ground. Rome had avenged all the destruction that Carthage had inflicted on it during the Punic Wars. However, Rome's victory was not total in terms of glory. The Roman world, now without its Carthaginian rival, began to feel the need for a real challenge. The very essence of the Roman Empire changed after the fall of Carthage. Rome now became the sole dominant power in the Mediterranean, but at a very high cost. And here a fundamental question arises. Was the destruction of Carthage the real price of Rome's greatness? After all, with the fall of Carthage, Rome now faced a new challenge: how to deal with absolute power and, more importantly, how to maintain the balance of power without a worthy rival. Now imagine, what would have happened if Carthage had been able to resist Rome? And what's more, how might history have unfolded if Hannibal had managed to conquer Rome? Comment below what you think, because this part of history left scars that still generate debate today. Do you think history would have been very different? Don't miss the next part, where we will analyze the legacy of Carthage and how its deeds still reverberate to this day. After more than a century of conflict, Carthage finally fell. The Third Punic War, 149 to 146 BC, brought about the total destruction of the city, but contrary to what many might have expected, this victory did not guarantee peace for Rome. In fact, the destruction of Carthage revealed the internal contradictions of Rome, which, now without a worthy rival, faced a new reality. The fall of Carthage was a moment of pure revenge, but also of despair. The Romans, relentless in their quest for revenge, destroyed the city, but they were unable to erase the impact that Carthage had left on Rome. During the Punic Wars, the Romans had learned a lot from their enemies, especially in terms of military strategy and resilience. Hannibal's skill, for example, became the stuff of legend in Rome, with his exploits studied by Roman generals for improvement. The destruction of Carthage, as well as being a military triumph, marked a turning point for Rome, which now had a new role to play. Without a powerful rival to directly confront, Rome needed to reconfigure its own identity, and this meant expanding its territory further, but also dealing with a number of internal issues that were emerging. Roman politics began to change, with attempts to centralize power and corruption spreading among the elite. But what is fascinating is that, even with the victory, Rome was about to enter a period of intense internal instability that would lead to the end of the Roman Republic and the rise of the Roman Empire. Now, a fundamental question arises: what was the true cost of Rome's victory? In destroying Carthage, the Romans were not only dismantling a civilization, but also destroying one of the greatest challenges they had faced in their history. The war brought them wealth and land, but at the same time it left a void. There was no one left to compete with. Rome had become the dominant power in the Mediterranean. But what was the next step? If its great rival had fallen, what would happen to the Roman Empire now? This leads to a deeper reflection on the concept of power. In the end, what really matters in building an empire? Is it the domination of land or the control of people's minds and hearts? This is a question that many historians have asked themselves. The rise of Rome, after the destruction of Carthage, marked the beginning of a new era. Rome conquered land, but Roman society began to fragment. The republican system was increasingly replaced by a military dictatorship, with figures such as Julius Caesar and Octavian Augustus seeking absolute power. By defeating Carthage, Rome paved the way for an internal political transformation that would change the course of history. It is also worth noting that Carthage did not disappear without leaving a legacy. Even in ruins, the city of Carthage, with its ports and advanced infrastructure, had a major influence on the development of the Roman economy. Rome absorbed many of Carthage's cultural aspects and used its architecture and building techniques in its own expansion. Carthage's legacy was not entirely erased. In a way, it survived under Rome's wing, helping to shape what we know today as the greatness of the Roman Empire. Now we have to ask, what would have become of Rome without Carthage? How would the Roman Empire have evolved if it had not faced this great enemy? Or, even more intriguingly, what would have been the impact on Western history if Carthage had won the Punic Wars? This would have completely changed the balance of power in the ancient world. Although the destruction of Carthage symbolized the end of an era, it also represented the beginning of a new dynamic for Rome, which, as it reached its peak, found itself facing new challenges, no longer from major military rivals, but from internal problems that threatened its stability. For example, the wealth gained from Roman victories led to the corruption of the elite, and social tensions began to rise. Internal struggles over succession and power struggles between leaders like Caesar and Pompey created fertile ground for the decline of the Republic and the birth of an imperial regime. The greatness of Rome, which seemed indestructible, was slowly eroded from within, with figures like Caesar openly challenging the republican system and Augustus creating a new type of government, the empire. What can we learn from this? The rise of Rome was impressive, but the fall of Carthage taught us valuable lessons about strategy, resilience, and how to deal with power. History shows us that the greatest threat to a civilization is not an external enemy, but rather the internal forces that can erode its foundation. Power, when not well managed, can turn against those who seize it. And now, with all that said, I leave you with this question. Is the real lesson from the destruction of Carthage that oftentimes the greatest threat lies not outside, but within our own walls? What do you think? Could Carthage have been a model of adaptation and growth, or was the city's fall inevitable? Leave a comment below and share your thoughts. And of course, be sure to follow along for the next fascinating story about the great empires of antiquity, where we'll explore how power can both elevate and destroy entire civilizations. Don't miss out, because the best is yet to come.